Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. As we kind of follow through 2 Corinthians and where we've been so far, we see that in chapter 2, the Apostle Paul begins to talk about this wonderful ministry that he was a part of. And he describes it as though he and his companions were emitting this sweet aroma of the knowledge of Christ. And it's pictured in a very beautiful way to where they were emitting this aroma of Christ that was bringing life to those who were receiving it. And then in chapter 3, we see how the Apostle Paul talked about the high ministry that he had in connection to the ministry of the new covenant, that is the ministry of the Spirit, and what a wonderful ministry that was. And then as we get into chapter 4, he talks about how they had gone about that ministry in a very pure and sincere way. And that section ends in a beautiful way where he says in verse 6, "For God, who said, 'Light shall shine out of darkness,' is the one who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." Just beautiful language there. But then as we get on into verse 7 and following, we find that the Apostle Paul says, yes, this is a wonderful ministry. Great things were happening, but at the same time, the Apostle Paul had to understand, or had to admit, that it was also very, very difficult. And when we get to chapter 11, we'll see a lot of the things that the Apostle Paul had to endure in connection to the gospel and in connection to being a minister of the gospel. There he talks about in verse 23, starting in verse 23, "Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so, in far more labors and far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys, and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. Who is weak without my being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern?" The Apostle Paul had a very rough go at the ministry. As beautiful and wonderful and glorious the ministry was, it was also a very difficult ministry that he had. And that's what he begins to describe back in our reading today in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, starting in verse 7, where he says, "But we have this treasure," the treasure of this wonderful knowledge that he had about Christ. "We have this treasure," he says, "in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God, and not from ourselves." And so he says that we have this wonderful blessing of the knowledge of God, but it's in these vessels of clay, so that the power will be of God and not of ourselves. So he says, you know what? All this brokenness, all this death, all this hardship and trials is a part of demonstrating the power of God working through these weaknesses. But notice how he describes the power of God working in his life. He says in verse 8, "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body." Here the Apostle Paul recognizes the fact that the power of God was working through him and through his companions. But it wasn't done in the way that we might expect. As we think about the power of God working through us as we're ministering and as we're working for the benefit of others, we might think that the power of God would be us being saved from all afflictions, all difficulties and hardships, that the power of God would cause us to not have to endure such things. But here the Apostle Paul says, no, the power of God is made more evident in these difficult things, in these weaknesses and these distresses. It could be that the Apostle Paul would only focus on the hardships he was experiencing. He could just say, well, we are afflicted, we're perplexed, we're persecuted, we're struck down, and we're always carrying about in our body the dying of Jesus. And that could have been the way he viewed his ministry and his whole approach to ministry. But he doesn't. He's very optimistic in the way that he talks about this, and in doing so, he shows how the power of Christ is done in a very hidden way. He says we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. And even in carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, he says the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. And so oftentimes the power of God is not manifested in a way in which he immunes us from difficulty and hardship, but it's in those hardships that his power is made evident. Because even though we do endure hard things, even though it is difficult, still there are evidences of his power, because he puts a limit to just how much this world can harm us and just how much this world can get to us. So the Apostle Paul recognized, yeah, I am afflicted, but you know what? I'm not crushed. Sure, I'm perplexed. Definitely not easy to be perplexed, but I'm not despairing. I'm persecuted, but you know what? I'm never forsaken. I'm struck down, but they're not destroying me. And so he's very optimistic in the sense that he recognizes that the world is giving him a rough go at this whole ministry that he's doing, but they can only do so much. The power of God was still upholding him. The power of God was still keeping him afloat, and the world couldn't completely destroy him. It was the power of God working through him. And so here we have a beautiful demonstration of how the power of God can be demonstrated not by keeping us from weakness or trials or distresses, but by working through those things and showing all the while God is with us to keep us and to guide us through it all. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.